Welcome to the Power of Play in partnership with Athleum Sports, where sport is more than just a game, it's a force for change. I am your host, David, and in this podcast, we explore on how businesses and organizations use sports to achieve positive social, environmental, and financial impact. I'm thrilled to be joined by my guest today, Emma Zwiebler, who is the CEO of the World Federation of Sporting Goods, also known as WFSGI. Welcome, Emma, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, David.
To kick things off, can you tell us a bit about your journey and how you ended up where you are today?
Yeah, sure. I'm now currently the CEO of the World Federation of the Sporting Goods Industry, or WFSGI for short. Both of those are a bit of a mouthful, I have to say, but we are the global trade association for sporting goods companies. We represent a really wide range of companies within our membership, so brands, manufacturers, and retailers. And we represent roughly 70% of the industry by global turnover. So it's a significant proportion of the industry that most people within sports know on just the brand side. We'll go into a bit more detail around who WFSGI is and what we prioritize and what we do on behalf of our members. But in a bit of a nutshell, a trade association is there to represent its members and to advocate for policies and priorities that are critical to them as an industry. I think we will go into the purpose of the organization, which I think fits in really well with obviously what you are talking about in terms of the powerful force that sport can be. We absolutely align to that. I think in terms of my own journey, probably the most important thing to say is that I could never have predicted that I would end up leading the Global Trade Association for Sporting Goods Companies. I am not sure I even knew what a trade association was when I was an athlete or back at university. So it's been an unpredictable journey, but it's been a wonderful one. I'm really very privileged to have the role that I do. I started my professional life as an athlete. So I was a former badminton player, played for my home country of Scotland for many years. Was a fantastic education, not just in sport and competition, but also in life. And I'm sure there's many athletes out there that feel the same. It's not just what I achieved on the court, but the experiences you have off the court that have really shaped me then and now. I retired pretty early on. I had an unfortunate kidney failure that caused me to retire from my sport. So I retired just after the Commonwealth Games in 2010. And at that time, I was studying for an undergraduate degree in chemistry. Not necessarily, again, an indication that I would end up at a trade association. But when I finished my career, I went into my final year of chemistry and decided, okay, I need to have a little bit of a plan about what do I do in life after sport. So I came up with this grand plan that I was going to combine my sports experience with the chemistry experience and become an anti-doping lawyer. So I went off, retrained as a lawyer, moved down to London, and managed to get myself what's known as a training contract. So the first step to becoming a lawyer. With an American firm that had a specific focus at that time around anti-doping law, which was a really interesting aspect, right? It still is an interesting aspect of sports law. It all went a little bit off the rails when about 2 weeks, I think before I joined the firm, I got a call from the partner that led that practice who said he was setting up his own boutique firm. There wasn't any money to take me with him. So I actually never did a single day of anti-doping law at all. But, I trained as a lawyer. I had a really great couple of years working as a sports litigator, sports commercial side. So kind of seeing a completely different side to the sports industry that I had grown up in. Obviously also a really great formal education. Being a lawyer teaches you many things, discipline and attention to detail definitely being one of them. But at some point in that period of time, I started to feel the pull of wanting to go back to what I'd always felt as an athlete, that sport has this incredible power to transform lives. It transformed mine, but I saw also more extreme examples. And I think it has this ability to unite people globally. And there was a huge pull in me feeling that I wanted to go back to that. And so I got an offer to join WFSGI in 2018. And I joined then as I think the title was VP for Strategic and External Affairs. I was leading the work with our member companies in their relationships with the International Sports Federation. So everything from the International Olympic Committee to FIFA to World Athletics, on various different topics. And then interestingly, because this had a big impact on my career and also my personal perspectives on life, I was asked to lead the work around physical activity. So how do we leverage the power of the industry to get the world to move more? And I'm sure we'll spend a lot of time on that in this call, but it was at that stage a bit of an eye-opener for me. You know, I'd come from this elite sport bubble, but I had no clue how many people, simply didn't have access to sport or physical activity or didn't feel it was for them, felt excluded from it, or didn't have the opportunities in life. And I became more and more personally invested in this topic, and we can talk about what we're doing now at WFSGI on that in a minute. But generally, was a great start to life at WFSGI. If I didn't have an idea of what a trade association was then, I definitely do now, and they have incredible potential to showcase, as a kind of bird's eye view of what an industry is experiencing at all different levels, and an incredible opportunity to engage with different stakeholders across the sport and outside the sport ecosystem. I had the chance 2 years ago, after our former CEO, who I know you know well, decided to leave in the summer of 23 after 16 really significant years leading the organization. And I had the chance to step up to CEO. And I think it was one of those moments when you're offered it that I thought, well, if I don't do this, I'm going to quit because I don't want to watch someone else do it. So incredible opportunity for me. I think it has been nearly 24 months. Where I've learned a lot. I feel like my own personal growth curve has probably not had the same trajectory since my first day in the office. But it's been brilliant. Learned a lot along the way, and yeah, really privileged and really happy to have a chance, not just to lead the organization, but also conversations with people like you about the work that we're doing.
Talking of which, so before we get into the midst of what the WFSGI is doing in relation to physical inactivity, can you tell us a bit in a nutshell what the organization's mission in general is?
As a new CEO, we aligned at the moment with our membership around a new purpose statement. So we would unite and support the global sporting goods industry to ensure a healthier, more active planet for all. And I think what was interesting about that purpose statement is that probably some of our most high profile work over the past couple of years had been in that elite sport world. And that purpose statement doesn't reference it at all. It's really focusing in on the top two priorities that companies identified, which is how do we leverage the power of our industry to get the world to move more? Physical inactivity is seen as one of the biggest long-term threats to our industry's development, as well as, of course, to physical health and sport participation. And then the second at that time being, how do we support companies to reduce their impact on the planet? So, very clearly, we are an industry that we consider to be a force for good, but we are also, of course, manufacturing products that enable people to be physically active.
Talking about the elephant in the room, which you addressed, and this is what our discussion will focus on today, is physical inactivity.
Yep.
Can you a bit put into context whom is considered to be physically inactive, and where do we see the biggest ratios of inactivity globally?
We use the World Health Organization's definition because for two reasons. One, they're the only ones who have a globally comparable data set on physical inactivity in youth, adults, and older adults. And number two, they're the only ones who have defined inactivity directly in relation to health. So they have different measurements for those three groups I mentioned, youth, adults, and adolescents. And for each of them, they have put together a recommended amount of activity per week that is designed as a very low barrier, but it is necessary to maintain the health of that person. So in adults, it's 150 minutes of moderate exercise per week. That can be walking, could be cycling to work. It doesn't need to be playing a tennis match, playing a badminton match. It doesn't need to be training for a marathon. It's really a low bar, 5 times 30 minutes per week. And for adolescents, it's slightly higher because of obviously their phase of development is 60 minutes per day. But this minutes of play that we are talking about, it doesn't need to be running. So we use the World Health Organization for those reasons because it's the one that gives that direct correlation to health of a person and because it's the only globally comparable data set that's available today. And when we look at the actual numbers, so the latest data we have for the adult population was published actually last year, so in summer of 2024, and adult inactivity is up at 31%, which is a 5% increase since 2010. So you can see that this is not it's not a short-term trend. It's not something that could be correlated directly to the impact of COVID. It's a long-term trend indicating clear behavioral change amongst the adult population. We are getting less and less active. And while 31% might not, as let's say, an overall percentage sound that big, you have to remember what inactivity means. It's a low bar. So if you go to some other measurement tools, expecting more movement, of course, that number will be higher. And the second thing to say is that actually that 31% equates to 1.8 billion people globally. And that number, to put it in context, is bigger than China, it's bigger than India. So we are talking about a significant proportion of people on the planet who have put their health at risk directly as a result of not moving enough. And what is probably more worrying for our industry, and I think also for sports generally, is the trend in the next generation, which is much more concerning. 81% of the next generation, so 11 to 17-year-olds, do not move their bodies enough to maintain good health. And I remember when I first read this statistic, I was kind of looking to see if I'd read the wrong way around. It's 18%, not 81%, but the facts are there. It's 81%. Has also been rising. They're due to publish the updated data set either this year or next. We're still waiting on that. But I think what we need to consider when we look at that number is two things. One, that means this next generation community is entering adulthood, potentially with their health already at risk directly as a result of not moving enough. The second thing is this youth population is our next generation consumers. When we look at sporting goods perspective, it's also our next generation employees. And, there's a direct correlation between productivity at work and, healthy, active lifestyles. And more generally for sports, they're our next generation participants, fans. So it really is a trend that while we might not see it today, I'm always reading these stats around, more of the next generation are engaged in watching digital content around Olympics or World Cup, but it's not participation. And we have to be really clear that when we talk about this trend, what we are seeing is a huge risk coming around the corner on that next generation.
What do you see as the root cause of this rising physical inactivity? Because particularly among youth and what you've mentioned and urban population, this is observed, right? And I think in one of your McKinsey-related podcasts, which I was honored to attend, I actually asked you the question, so where do we see this? This is first world country, wealthy nations where this can be observed the strongest. Is this coming from the fact that sport has become boring or not trendy enough for youth to participate? Or is this simply an evolving competition between physical activity versus digital technology that keeps kids at home?
I think it's a really good question. I don't want to sound like a politician, but there's multiple answers to this. But I mean, when we look, just to answer the question around inactivity trends, where does this originate or where is it worst? Let's say, I mean, I have the breakdowns for the data from the adult inactivity that was published by WHO in 2018. I think it's still to be updated for last year. But the trend there showed that actually the highest levels of inactivity are in high income nations, followed pretty closely behind by middle income nations. and quite far behind by low-income nations. So low-income nations are actually way below that global average, which at that time was 28% adult inactivity. Now it's risen to 31%. And high-income countries were way above that average. And I think, you know, let's say that's the macro perspective, okay? So it's definitely not, and I think I remember you asking that question. It's definitely not an issue that's just around low income countries, not at all. In fact, it's almost the reverse.
Yeah.
What you do see though is that low-income families within high-income countries. There is a direct correlation there between access to sport and activity because of the cost of doing sport and physical activity. So, see a little bit. You have to look at macro and micro factors when we're considering all of this, and there's definitely not one answer across all communities. But I think what we can say has definitely been a coexisting trend as we go through from 2010 when the data start being tracked to where we are in 2025 is of course the digital transformation that has taken place globally. And we're not going to go backwards. We're not going to suddenly start writing with pen and paper again like we did at school. So I think I don't think it's a helpful framing to say it's us versus them, but I definitely think that sport and physical activity has to adapt to understand how do we still attract and engage, particularly that next generation. I mean, I don't know what age you were when I got my first mobile, but I must have been maybe 14 years old, something like that. And I had that phone where the text was all in one line and you had to wait about 5 minutes to read the entire text
Yeah.
message. I mean, it's so crazy. My daughter's, she's only 2.5. She doesn't have a phone yet, thank God. But like, she will grow up in a completely different world to what I grew up in. And what I think we have probably, and this is more of a sports sector comment than just a sporting goods industry perspective, but we have to adapt. We have to understand that that's the environment they're growing up in. And we have to think, how do we continue to make sure that sport and physical activity stays relevant? It stays continuing to be a core part of what a government or a community offers, because sport and movement, but particularly sport, has some additional elements. It offers so much more to a kid than what you and I had, right? So obviously we had the privilege to go on to be elite athletes and live a career like that. But everything from physical health development, mental health development, confidence, social skills, these are things that come to a child, whether they're playing at recreational level in the playground or the school fields, or they play like you and I did on a professional circuit. So there's a lot of things around sport and physical activity that we will miss, not just health aspects, if we don't manage to evolve the offering to fit that next generation.
Well, I mean, you touch upon a sensitive point there because, I mean, so what is esports then being considered?
Uh-huh. I'll have a go. And it doesn't make the podcast, everyone knows why. Now look, there's two different classes of esports, right? There is esports which you can better equate to what you and I knew as a younger age as gaming, right? I played N64, I played GoldenEye, I played all these things. There is no way that anyone is convincing me that that has any sport or physical activity engaged in it, right?
There's a competitive part, though.
There's a competitive part, but there's not a physical activity part, right? And
Yeah.
I actually had a really interesting debate with someone about this concerning chess, because chess has a really great competitive element, strategic thinking, but the physical activity element is what has been debated. Now, if I remember correctly, chess has been classified as a sport. Someone can pressure test, your listener can pressure test when I'm right, but I think that's correct.
It is.
So, and now there is obviously esports in terms of these types of games, Fortnite or whatever, being played with people in stadiums watching, right? Because it can be engaging. I remember
Yeah.
watching my friends play, what was it? Sonic something, I don't know. And it's kind of fun to like sit there and watch like as they do it. So like I'm not dismissing that element of it or the social connectivity because you can do it online together. I think the question is, does it deliver the physical health or mental health benefits that, let's say, classical tennis or running or whatever it does? And that's why I say you have to distinguish between those games, which are almost the competitive version of what we played when we were younger, what might come up more with virtual reality games, if you look at Swift, for example, if you look at some of the sports that are experimenting with augmented reality, with virtual reality, where there's a physically physical movement element. Now, for me, that's something to be explored, right? It's not something to be dismissed because, as we said in the last section, that next generation is growing up as tech first, or digital first. So, embracing that, exploring the different avenues, to engage kids with digital tools that include movement, in my head is an interesting opportunity to explore, right? I mean, I don't have the data to hand on how that impacts mental health or anything like that, but I think just generally that integration of movement with the digital world is interesting. There's still Now, I don't have the citation to hand of the study, but there's a study out there which we can look up afterwards around the health benefits on step count of Americans who played Pokemon Go. So you remember so Pokemon, obviously people know, and they developed this element called Pokemon Go where you had to look for Pokemons in real world context. And there is a paper out there, I'd have to send it to you afterwards, which talks about not just the increase in step count in Americans as they went out in the world looking for Pokemons, but actually the sustained increase in step count. So, there are some interesting like digital interventions that I don't want to write off because, I maybe have a perception around gaming or esports. But I mean, when we talk about inactivity, we are talking about something that is one of the four main causes of non-communicable diseases, which is almost as hard to say as WFSGI, but essentially diseases that are incurred as a result of unhealthy lifestyles. The other three are tobacco, so smoking, alcohol, so drinking too much, and poor nutrition. And physical inactivity is the fourth. So there is probably a place in the world for esports, gaming, everything else, but we have to think about how we address that inactivity crisis. And that's what we shouldn't lose sight of when we're talking about are we in competition with that or not. The real thing is we have to solve that cause, that root issue, which is around the fact that the world is moving less and less.
And I think that's a wonderful transition on how do you see the evolving role of WFSGI in combating this negative trend? Are there specific campaigns, collaborations, or advocacy efforts on that WFSGI is leading or supporting right now?
Yeah, so think we've been on a bit of a journey as an industry and as an organization. I can sit here in 2025 and talk really articulately about this definitely being a long-term threat. It's also an opportunity for our industry, right? To tap that 1.8 billion adults to help the next generation, to become active. But when I joined in 2018, there was a core group of companies that were already saying the same lines I've said today. They were already convinced that this was an issue, a long-term issue that the industry had to be aware of. At that time, it felt like a fringe agenda, let's say. It wasn't necessarily core to everything that was going on at WFSGI, although it was a very important and very passionate group of brands that were in that moment. And that was the group that I had the privilege to learn all of this about, or to start learning and to work with. And what has happened since that time is we've seen a growing awareness in the industry about this topic, about this, this data, which is really long-term and compelling around why we need to take more action. We've obviously had also a global pandemic, which showed in a very real way to the industry and to sport what happens if everything shuts down and people stop moving. It seems like a long time ago now, but sports centers were shut, gyms were shut, swimming pools were shut. People were not allowed to play four people on a court in tennis, same in badminton. And although it was for a different reason, you saw almost an overnight impact on what it would mean on sports clubs. I mean, some sports clubs folded, right, because participation went through the floor. Some sporting goods companies folded because sales went through the floor and they couldn't, they weren't able to save it in the moment. And I obviously this is a little bit my own interpretation of it, but I think that moment generally gave momentum and gave clarity to, okay, if we don't take action now as industry, as sport generally, to essentially save ourselves, right, to save our sector, then in maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in 2 years, but in 10, 15, 20 years' time, the digital transformation is carrying on, right? When I started in 2018, I'm not even sure people were talking about NFTs or the metaverse, right? We went through that and now we're on AI. I mean, the pace of change in digital transformation is ongoing as we speak, and we need to catch up as sports and physical activity and understand how do we evolve going forwards. So all of that to say, when I started, there was a very core group of engaged companies within our membership that were driving this agenda. We're now up at 30 to 40 companies that are on a week in, week out basis, working with our colleague, to understand how do we, as an industry, play our part. That's also an important aspect. We cannot resolve this alone, right? The inactivity crisis, much like the climate crisis, bigger than any company, it's bigger than any industry. This has to be our industry playing an important role, speaking out collectively, acting collectively where appropriate. But we need others to come on the journey with us. And there's probably two key moments that lead to where we are today, which I'm really enthused about. I have a lot of energy about the direction we're going in. After the COVID-19 pandemic, I had the opportunity, we'd been working in a kind of let's say what's called a dialogue system with the World Health Organization at that time. So they published in 2018, they published what's known as the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity. Essentially, that is a roadmap for countries to help them elevate levels of physical activity. So the World Health Organization's key stakeholders are its countries, so its member states, and they published this roadmap essentially setting out how a country might increase levels of physical activity within them to help drive population health. When they published that report, they set two, and that was set in agreement with the countries. They set two targets. They would like to reduce physical inactivity. Sorry, it's always difficult switching between inactivity and activity. The targets were set, they would like to reduce physical inactivity by 10% by 2025 and 15% by 2030. So in 5 years' time, when the SDGs report. We are so far off that. It's unbelievable. I mean, when the data was published last year, as I said, adult inactivity has increased, not decreased, and we're still waiting on the youth data, but we're not expecting, positive news on that front. So they set out this roadmap in 2018. Total coincidence, it was the year I joined WFSGI. But in that roadmap, they made a very clear call that to do this, the public sector had to work better with the private sector and had to particularly look at how do they engage the sports sector. And so my first year at WFSGI, I had the opportunity to join what was called the Sports Sector Dialogues at the World Health Organization. So they invited the equivalents of me in the gym and fitness industry, obviously sporting goods. They also invited some institutional sport and really started this series of roundtables going, okay, how do we actually bridge the gap between public health, which is obviously what ministers of health are looking at, and what we are doing in the wider sports sector, right? And trying to connect dots to understand how do we work better together for the same core outcome. And that's what's very interesting about this topic is that when it comes to engagement of public and private sector, there's very often some challenging discussions that need to be had. But here, there's actually a really unique alignment of public and private sector goals, because the public goal here is, of course, to improve public health through increased physical activity. The private sector goal is, of course, to grow business through the exact same thing, increasing levels of physical activity. And that alignment, of course, as sports, we are also, the majority of people that work here are also passionate about people and sports. But like if we align those, it's that really unusual alignment of public and private sector goals. And so we started that engagement, and through and beyond the pandemic, we started exploring probably like everything was accelerated during the pandemic. We started accelerating our thinking on how do we actually, as WFSGI, focusing in on industry for a second, how do we actually leverage the power of what we have in our membership to work better with them? And shortly after it's hard to know when the pandemic actually ended, but shortly after, we concluded what is the first ever memorandum of understanding between the World Health Organization and a private sector, were known as business associations in their terminology, solely focused on how do we improve public health through increased levels of sport and physical activity. And this was a bit of an eye-opener, I think, for our industry, also for the people that we work with at WHO, that there was so much convergence and so much opportunity to actually work together. And of course, when you have that formalization of a relationship, it also opens doors, right, to explore different ways. And we've been building on that moment pretty successfully over the last couple of years. So if you had followed WFSGI, I'm not sure that many people followed WFSGI, but if you had followed WFSGI through the last couple of years, we've spoken up much more frequently and with much more clarity around the physical activity, inactivity crisis. We only ever use the WHO data set because we're convinced it's the right data set to articulate this. But more importantly, we've also managed to engage many more companies in this. And last year, we had a very important moment in industry that is actually leading to a lot of the work that I'll talk about in a second that we're doing this year. So when the World Health Organization published its new data on adult inactivity, we had a unique moment in the industry where we had 20 CEOs and C-suite leaders and around about 45 organizations come out together in the same day, the same moment, with a collective message that more needs to be done on this topic, both in industry and out. Now, they did it in their own unique voices and their own unique brand ways, but we had never before had this collective message. And it was an incredibly powerful moment. As trade association, we are not often the most high-profile organization, especially when you represent the biggest brands in the world. But this message resonated. People saw it. People saw that the industry was coming out to talk about a topic that we maybe had been visible on a community level or on a national level before, but never on this globally unified message. And from there, we've really been building the momentum internally to understand, okay, what is it specifically that our industry can do better? And we have two big moments coming up that we've been working on. The first is that on the 22nd of May, so not very far away, we will host our first ever side event at the World Health Assembly, focused solely on the physical activity as a health and an economic imperative. And there we will be showcasing what is the industry already doing and making a very clear call that more needs to be done collectively. And on that day, we will be publishing the industry's first impact report. So showcasing what the industry is already doing to tackle physical inactivity, and really focusing in on those case studies and examples that target that inactive. I think sports as a sector and us as an industry, we're really excellent at getting active people to be more active. But the challenge is, how do we get the inactive? And just last thing to say, and then stop, like in this impact report, we've looked at 4 ways. So we've looked at advocacy, which obviously we are driving at WFSGI level, but we also see happening at the company and community level. We've looked at your classic programmatic intervention, right? So how are companies engaging with communities to help the inactive become active in a sustained way? And then we've looked at 2 ways in which are classically thought of as industry strong points, but using them in a different way to approach the inactive. The first is product innovation. So looking at product innovation from the breaking down barriers aspect. So how do companies innovate product to help remove barriers to physical activity and sport? And the last one is around campaigns. And this is a really interesting one because, sport is, I mean, probably not for your podcast audience, but outside of the sports bubble, let's say. Sport itself is quite a polarizing word. Some people immediately think great memories, school, university, going to matches or whatever. And some people immediately think, God, I hate sport. Like, and it took me a long time to realize that sport is much more polarizing than, let's say, movement or play or activity. So we are looking in this final area around campaigns that change perceptions about what it means to be physically active, to be engaged in sport. And there's some really great examples in there. I think the classic one from last year was, I don't know if you saw it, but ASICS did a campaign called Desk Break, where if you've ever watched the show Succession, they had Logan Roy, so the protagonist, obviously very scary man in the boardroom, basically coming out and saying, I'm not the thing to fear in the office. You know, it's being sedentary. And it was just such an amazing moment, interplay of pop culture figure. You would never expect him to be talking about physical activity. And the message really landed. And exploring how brands are utilizing this approach to really try and, showcase especially physical activity, that broader terminology, as being something that's inclusive and available for all. And that was the longest answer I think that's ever been given on a podcast. So there you go.
We will check on the Guinness record.
Yeah.
If maybe we can nominate you for that.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
For that, so
Yeah.
there's a competitive spirit.
Yeah.
Talking about the industry and its
Yeah.
responsibility, how can the sporting industry move from being just a product provider to become an enabler and promoter of an active lifestyle?
So I think those four ways that I just mentioned are the ways. So whether it's advocacy, product innovation campaigns, or programmatic interventions, we will always be a product provider, right? Like if you think about the solution or the problem that we are trying to solve, we are trying to solve for a problem that our industry, that impacts sport, that impacts health, that impacts government funding, everything else. At our core, sporting goods companies provide and manufacture products that help people to be active. So that, of course, will stay. Because of the trends that we have seen, we are having to innovate to understand where is our strong suit to actually help tackle this crisis. And that's why those four areas and are really the ways in which we have identified that industry can move forward. I think what's an important layer on top, which is what WFSGI's, strong suit is also talking about it, right? It's like also showcasing that the industry is thinking differently about this. And that, last year when that statement was published, we had really interesting responses. I had from some people in the sporting goods industry, I had things like, thank God you're speaking up on this. It's such a big issue. I had people saying, I didn't even know this was an issue. So, I had a whole range within the industry. And outside, it was almost exactly the same. So it was this moment where, okay, a very powerful community within the sport ecosystem and also beyond is speaking up on a topic that I think you and I know is consistently overlooked. I mean, how many times are headlines around the world talking about obesity treatments or anti-tobacco campaigns? The only time I ever saw physical activity being front page news was during the pandemic, when people were talking about the importance of go out for a walk, make sure you get your activity in per day. So I think I think the perception of the industry as it stands today is probably not wholly accurate, that we are, it's only products, because that's not the experience we have at WFSGI. What we need to do better as WFSGI is to really articulate what is the industry doing. And this is the purpose of this report. It's also the purpose of speaking up, is that we believe the industry has a powerful voice and it can be a galvanizing force for more in industry to do more, but also for other stakeholders to do more.
And this is a point where I think we have to differentiate
Mhm.
between output, outcome, and
Yeah.
impact. The output for me is simply the effort that you put in. The outcome is for me that actually I can measure that there is something of an outcome that I wanted to reach.
Mhm.
And the impact is the last evolution of this entire learning process, that it's sustainably staying in place. And so where are we in this evolution?
I think you have the right analysis. I know, I think it is the right analysis, and we are really candid, within our physical activity strategy framework. The first one is align for impact, which means we have to get more companies in our industry doing more. So let's focus on the outputs there. We need more companies doing more on the output side before we even consider the next two. The third one was impact. What was the second? Outcome, and then impact, right? So we need more companies doing that, right? I said we were really proud last year to have 40 companies signing off on this statement. That's great. Really huge progress from where I was when I joined in 2018, was 5 companies around the table. It's 40 companies in a very large industry. So still some way to go, right? Before this is ringing in every single boardroom. But you also have to acknowledge progress, right? 5 to 40 is still a big jump. And here we have to stop before we go on to outcomes and impact, because we have to look across the sports sector and say, how many institutions, clubs, rights holders are even thinking about outputs at this stage? Because we are not getting necessarily the full traction from the sports sector on outputs that could be, right? There is not a unified movement. There are some organizations that are doing it, but it is not consistent across the sports sector, that they should be doubling down on this and focusing on outputs to transform the future, of participation. Now, when it comes to outcome and impact, of course, you're absolutely right, but this has been one of the big problems around tracking and evaluating the impact of, oh, that's difficult to say, tracking and evaluating or measuring the impact of physical activity interventions. It's been a problem. There's a leading set of indicators that were developed by the Commonwealth Secretariat to measure the impact of interventions on physical activity against SDGs. I don't know where that is being used, right? But this methodology, this harmonized methodology, it's not being embraced across institutions, and it's certainly not being embraced within sports sector generally. There's a really interesting model that was developed by UEFA together with, I think, UNESCO and a few other institutions around the social return on investment in sport and physical activity. Great example of sports trying to explore this, but it's not yet harmonized. There's not one standard against where you measure impact. Now, where I think the comparison to climate change absolutely plays out is, what is the one thing that everybody knows is an indicator of climate change? Carbon emissions. And there you go. There's a harmonized currency, if you want, for another want of another phrase. And typically, I think established mechanisms for measuring it that are relatively consistent. We don't have that on sport and physical activity. We don't have a CO2 equivalent that you can compare at people, institution, country, global level. So definitely there is some way to go on measuring outcomes and impact. But I am really positive that just transforming, you have to start somewhere, right? Like, so you have to acknowledge there is a way to go for sure. But just transforming the fact that if we can really play a galvanizing force as industry, if we can get more people, if we can get 80, 90% of the industry speaking out on this topic, speaking to the rights holders that they sponsor, speaking to the governments that they work with, it's already a powerful step forwards, even without outcomes and impact. I'm going to get confused on that. But we also need other stakeholders in this space to do it, right? So we also need institutional sports to do it. We also need to think about, how do you bring ministers of health? How do you bring community sports? How do you bring other investors into this dialogue? And I think you're absolutely right that what your overall summary shows is that sport, and here I mean sport has become fantastic at measuring certain things. It's fantastic at measuring fan engagement, fan reach, economic return of major sporting events. but talk about social impact, talk about health impact, talk about outcomes and interventions that really help drive social change. We all talk about Nelson Mandela, sport is it can be a powerful force for good. Sport can change the world. I 100% believe that, but we believe it based on intuition. We don't believe it based on data. So
Yep.
you're absolutely right that there's a gap. I wouldn't lay the blame, and I mean, obviously, I'm an industry rep, so people can take this with a pinch of salt. I wouldn't lay the blame for the gap at the industry's door. You know, it's a bigger systemic problem, and it is here we go to the sophistication of the sport ecosystem. You know, you look at other industries that are out there, whether it's food and beverage, big pharma, you know, they have data on their fingertips to talk about how, you know, a intervention helps drive outcomes and impact. You wouldn't be having this same conversation with them, but you are having it with me. And I think it's right that we're having it. But it's a bigger problem than just industry not being able to track, I don't know, the impact of product innovations.
I think you brought this topic up just before earlier, but I just would like to zoom in on that. In your view, the sporting goods companies, have they been focused too much in the past already on the active audiences? And instead of the ones who are really just considering doing sports, or they're distant and try to pull them in. What's your view on that?
It's a good question. I think there's probably more at play than that. That's probably it's probably too simple an analysis because you also have to look at the trajectory of how the industry has grown and people's behavior towards sport and physical activity. So, you know, decades and decades and decades ago, manual labor was a really big part of the workforce, right? I mean, I come from the UK, you know, we had farming, we had shipbuilding, and we had mining. You know, these are manual labor activities where physical movement is a, you know, bigger part of people's day-to-day lives. And that has obviously changed over time. The perception of sport and physical activity has also changed over time, right? So at the time where the industry was developing, they were, you know, also growing as companies and selling into people as they started to have more disposable income, more time for leisure, more time for sports. So I'm not sure that it was a question that came up at that time, right? You know, I was born in 1986, right? I definitely wasn't there at the start of industry growth and the start of inactivity trends, but I would say just generally on a let's say a human trend perspective and an industry growth perspective, there's probably some interesting correlations that went through time around why it's evolved this way. But having said all of that, it's definitely something we've identified as WFSGI together with the companies that we're working with on the physical activity committee that and I think actually you referenced the McKinsey report, we talk about that. That 1.8 billion inactive adults, it's a huge opportunity. It's a huge untapped market. But to get there, you have to change your approach, like you do when you target any new market, right? So I think there has to be, if we really as an industry want to, you know, go after is the wrong word, but want to play our part in transforming inactive to active, yes, there needs to be some changes. Some companies are already doing it really well, and that's those ones that have been championing this for a long time. But of course, we need more and more to be doing that. Yeah.
Because I'm, I don't want to make any promo now for any particular company. I've used, there are some of my favorites definitely that
Yeah.
I used throughout my sporting career, but I never had really the feeling, when I go into a sport shop, yeah, should that be whichever, then I mean, I'm the one who would just buy the whole shop, yeah, because I love everything that is. I see a basketball, I see tennis balls, I see tennis rackets, swim
Mhm.
goggles. I would buy everything. But I always feel that these products are talking to me and not to the girl, for instance, who said that I'm not going to do sports because I invented some reason not to participate in PE class.
Yeah, and but that's where I think the industry is on an evolution, right? Okay, let's not name names, but you know, there are a number of brick and mortar retailers out there who are investing in community programs, using their stores for different reasons, bringing kids in, going out into communities where they might not come into a sports store in the way you said. So I'm not disagreeing that there doesn't need to be a change in a change in approach for this community. But you also have to remember that the businesses are also servicing people who are already active, right? So it will never be a complete pivot. That would never make sense. But to target those groups, of course, there has to be a change in approach. And that's really what we're trying to hopefully encourage through our work with these companies that are already committed to doing this.
I mean, I would never have a problem to mention that particular brand. I think we think of the same one, which is Decathlon,
Mm.
which does an amazing job when it comes to community engagement and reframing the message around
Yep.
sports. But from a business perspective, how important do you believe it is for brands to redefine their value proposition from not just around performance, which we see on at the Nikes, Adidas, Essex type of brands, which I observe, to around joy, community, and everyday movement, which is
So
more the decathlon approach.
So I don't think it will ever be either or. I think it has to be and that's that's obviously what we highlighted in this year's McKinsey report is that tackling inactivity requires a different approach. In last year's report, we actually talked about the fact that we start to see this evolution already. So, even brands that are renowned for high performance products, they are also innovating their approach towards the inactive. But you know, you might not necessarily see all of that because you're an active consumer. So the adverts that are focused on the inactive community are maybe not ones that you engage with, right? So I think there's also, we know it is happening. We know that, you know, there are a good percentage of our membership, okay, not as many as we would like, that's the journey we're on, who are exploring this and who are using real people in campaigns, not using elite athletes, not talking about performance, talking about community. But of course, they're trying to engage, to do this successfully, you have to engage these people where they are, which is not in sports stores, right? Because that's part of the problem. And it's not in sports clubs because that's also part of the problem. So it is a different process, and it will always be and for sure, because again, if we look at the McKinsey report we published this year, I mean, you have to put side by side the trends that the industry is seeing. We have also the hyper active people that are coming out, which is an amazing trend for our industry, for health. People who are, not just doing activity on a regular basis, but defining themselves by it, right? And that's an amazing subset of the community, but it's not the inactive community. So it will always be and for the industry that you have to address these two different communities. And of course, they require two different approaches. So I do think it is happening. I th and this is not a us versus them comment, but it is also an evolution that difficult to say, institutional sport needs to go through, right? Like I talked a little bit, I can talk about badminton here, it's a comfortable one. If I look at the pathway I went through to become an elite player, if I'd hated sport as a kid, I would never have picked up a badminton racket. So, there is also a job to be done, whether it's by physical education, in schools, whether it's by clubs and community sports, whether it's by sports federations, to pivot their mindset and to, you can obviously say that the pace of change is maybe not where you would like it to be. We will also talk about that because that's why we still have inactivity levels rising. But I come back to the fact that the industry cannot resolve this alone. We need everybody that is engaged in this ecosystem to also think about that inactive community, because they will not just knock down the door of the local sports club because they ostensibly think that sport is not for them. So, a hand-in-hand engagement, recognition, and a perception change, absolutely in industry. We're on that journey, but also in institutional sports.
And that takes me to my next question, which is basically an extension to this part. Is there room or perhaps even a need for new types of business models like subscription based or try before you buy that companies can elaborate upon and or should elaborate upon remove those barriers where people, especially you mentioned tariffs, which is going to make things more expensive and less affordable and less attractive to those people who are not willing to engage in sports, to give them the entrance to try things.
Yeah, and a number of these business models are being trialed across the industry. I mean, the classic example here is the bike, right? Because not only is it great for health, it's also active transport, reduces carbon emissions. And there's a number of bike companies that are exploring these different, systems and models. And one of the things that's a challenge there is that there is inconsistent regulation across governments around how they handle this, right? So the classic when I was working in London was the bike to work scheme, right, which offered, huge discounts or opportunities for people to try, without necessarily committing huge amounts of money. And these are not consistent across countries, so it's very difficult to plan as business, it's global business. Okay, how do we roll these things out? But definitely there's, different ways to explore. And I think when I talked earlier about the product innovation, that's also an interesting way to explore, right? Like, how do they adapt to the needs of the consumer today and to the needs of the inactive consumer? So there's a lot of different things that are being trialed. I expect sometimes I'm never quite sure how fully the climate change to human change example bears out, right? But it feels like we are at collectively as the world at this kind of early stage of climate change before it was necessarily embraced by everybody that needed to act upon it. Like, so we as industry are starting to speak out. Some people in the sports sector are starting to speak out. But I think these examples, these iterations of what works and what hasn't worked will only bear out over the next 5 to 10 years as we understand how do we actually move things forwards. And that's comes back to another broader point. So I mentioned earlier around the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity, which was signed off by member states, so by countries. So they embraced this roadmap for the 10% reduction by this year and 15% by 2030. And largely it's actions to be taken by countries, right? Not everyone. There's also like, how does our sector do it, etc. And in 2022, the WHO reported on progress. How have countries actually done in taking these steps? And one of the first lines in this report is progress is slow and uneven, which is, if I translate that into business speak, we are so far off in terms of implementing these priorities that, there's nothing diplomatically nice that we could possibly say. And it's something like 7 out of 30 priorities, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, that had been implemented by more than 50% of countries. Seven out of 30. And, I don't say that to, divert the discussion or to shift, not blame, but to shift responsibility, right? I think we accept and acknowledge as the industry, we are key stakeholder in this. I do it to say that we need everybody to be recognizing that and everybody that's important to making a change to be stepping up to the plate, because we will not be able to transform it alone. And so, it is we are hopeful, or let's say because we're a sporting goods industry, right? We're positive and we are driven. We're hopeful that by aligning more of our industry, even if we start with the outputs, to go back to your analogy, aligning more on people and making more commitments around outputs. If we can then use our voice to encourage other stakeholders to do more, right? Even if you just shift it incrementally, we will already have made big progress from where we are today. But right now as it stands, I said WHO reported in 22 that they will not make this target of 10% reduction in 2025. Wouldn't it be a great news story if actually by starting to speak out, by starting to align the industry, by hopefully moving some other stakeholders, we get a little bit closer to that 15% reduction by 2030? It's probably maybe too much to hope we actually get there, but just to move forwards and stop moving backwards would already be a seismic change.
I think the topic that you touch also, especially when we talk about the metrics part, is extremely critical, because lots of these metrics seem to be not defined unless we're talking about maybe human rights. Human rights is something where it is clearly defined by law. Then you have your environmental aspects where you have CO2 emissions, which is a number and you can quantify it. However, I feel a reluctancy in companies that they are kind of scared to engage in these type of activities, because when it comes to their ESG reporting, these are hard to grasp, and every company who is engaging it, doesn't matter which big brand we are talking about, is then afterwards accused of greenwashing. So
Mm.
how much do you see that holding back companies in doing such engagements?
I mean, on the physical activity side, we're making a huge strides forwards with this impact report, right? It showcases what companies are already doing today. I am sure that we will be told that we are not doing enough. I think what we are certain on is that, and this is more of a philosophical comment, is that we're on the right side of history, right? We're on the right side of history to start speaking out on this and to start encouraging our industry to do more. We're being transparent that not enough is being done. But we should also be, encouraged by the work that is being done, right? So to take motivation from, I mean, you're a former athlete as well, right? We all know that elite performance is a journey, and the best way to lose motivation is to fail to acknowledge the starting point, right? Because that's how it's a hard mountain to climb here, right? To change perceptions, to change priorities, and to bring other people with you. So I think we've started. I mean, the comments you make around ESG reporting and criticism of the industry, I mean, this has been a challenge, right? I don't think I don't think this is the podcast to dive into the depths of that. But of course, that's something that is generally being faced as a challenge by all industries, not just ours, is how to handle, corporate engagement and corporate commitment towards SDGs, towards moving towards a more sustainable planet. And it's not just the reporting factor, right? You mentioned, or I mentioned tariffs earlier. We're also in the middle of geopolitical challenges where the perspective on sustainability is not the same in Europe as it is in Asia or as it is in the US. And there are inconsistencies in approach globally don't help when you are either a company or a person trying to move towards a more sustainable future. So these inconsistencies in approach, whether it's government, whether it's regulation, these are also a challenge. And of course, yes, there is an element of the reporting has brought about more attacks for sure. But as an industry, as a association, we're comfortable to say that, that is part of our priorities is how do we support companies to reduce impact on the planet. And I'm pretty confident that, no matter what feedback we get around this impact report, it will be an important stage in our journey, right? And hopefully what we'll see, I think the current plan is that we publish on a 2-year frequency, so not every year, but every 2 years. My hope is that we will start to see real progress, admittedly on the outputs, right? But by how many we are able to showcase, we're obviously doing a snapshot in time now, but hopefully you will start to see that momentum and that trajectory pick up, and that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely. And so what's your vision for how the sporting goods industry can lead this systematic change over the next to 5, 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back a little bit to what I've said a couple of times. This is a systemic issue. So, you and I, if we take us as an example, we didn't get to where we got to in tennis and badminton simply through our own drive, right? This is a misconception, right? At some point, somebody either put you in front of a tennis match or gave you a tennis racket or encouraged you to go to a club. Same for me. I started an after school club because my mum worked full time in badminton. This is everything in life is like, it's about the systems around you. And in terms of encouraging people to start sport, to start physical activity, and to continue it, and that last bit being the most important, we have systemic problems, right? It's not just about access to products. It's not just about access to or affordable sports coaching or environments. There's a whole host of issues that are going on. So we feel that there are three really important things that we can do as industry. And the first we've spent a fair bit of talking about, which is how do we align our industry, right? How do we become not just a powerful industry voice, but really speaking out, aligned as an industry, bringing more companies into the movement year on year. So we've got a really good starting group, and I'll always be proud of the companies that are driving this with us. But obviously, we need to bring more in. We need to use our network and our positioning as one of the key stakeholders in sport and business to bring more stakeholders into this system, right? So we need to make sure that we are issuing that call to action to other stakeholders. There are some that are doing some great work. I don't want to discount it or discredit it, but we need more because very clearly industry cannot resolve this alone. And then I think it comes down to more of and that's where it comes down to trade association level. We need to make sure that we are engaging, not just bringing people on a movement, right? That will not deliver enough, right? It sounds great and it feels great to be part of. We also need to be fueling change with those people that have the ability to actually drive change on the ground. And these are policymakers, these are governments. We need to make sure that we are giving a credible voice as to what is it that we are asking for? Why do we believe it's so vital for people to do more sports and physical activity? And of course, we need them to follow up to finance that. So I think those three ways, they sound very big and lofty, and they feel big, when we look forwards. But if we can make a small amount of difference, if we can push forwards more companies in our industry across different sport segments to talk and to think and to act differently, if we can bring more stakeholders with us, and of course, if we can use our voice to actually encourage change into how sport and physical activity is treated at the global and the level, then we'll have made a big start.
What's you're going into bit the cool down part of it. So was there a moment in your life where you realized how powerful movement or sport can be?
Yes, and I will do it. So I said earlier in my introduction that I retired from sport after I had kidney failure, and it was a pretty extreme moment for me. I'd been an elite athlete. All of a sudden, I was in hospital, and not able to do much, to be honest. And all of that led to an operation to remove one of my kidneys, and sort of 6 or 7 months inside a hospital. And at that stage, I was feeling a lot, right? Of course, as you can imagine, because I basically had to make a decision. Do I try to go back to my career? Do I not? What on earth do I do now? Because sport and badminton has been my identity since 12 years old. And after I got out of hospital, I made that decision quite quickly. I'd been an average, middling to average badminton player on the global scene, and great experience, and it's built my life, and I will always be grateful for it. But it felt like this was the right moment to say no. So having made that decision, I was like, well, now I need to actually learn to walk again, because that's where I was. And you know, it was a very humbling experience going from having been someone that was training 4 to 6 hours a day, traveling the world, my body being like, what it was supposed to be. I was about to say temple, but I think that's not the right phraseology, but like a machine ready to deliver. And I never forget the first time I went for a run after this. I lasted 7.5 minutes and I was in agony all over my body. And I had to call my boyfriend at the time to come pick me up. And he was like, "What are you doing? You're so stupid." And at that moment, I remember feeling like I will never forget this moment of how important movement is to how I feel, how my body feels, how I feel physically and mentally. And of course, we're human beings, we all forget it. I think I've forgotten it in like 2 years. But that moment still comes back to me when I think about, as I built my life out, my second life, if you want to call it. And actually, I'm just laughing because Robert would tell you this. I'm always the person that gets up in the morning at 6 a.m. to do my workout, or I do it late at night. And I've done that because of that moment. I've not done that because I was that elite athlete. I've done that because in that moment, I realized what movement is and why it's so important for you as an individual. And of course, that moment combined with what I learned when I joined WFSGI is kind of combined. So like I had this prioritization of movement as I went into my next phase of life, let's say, was always people in my law firm were laughing. I used to run to work with this really ugly running backpack on my back. But like it was so important for me that I, embedded movement into my life, not competitive sport. I haven't played a single moment of competitive sport since I left, but movement. And then when I learned at WFSGI that this isn't available to everyone or they're not aware, like I think that is kind of those personal passions, that professional purpose. I mean, a lot of people talk about this, right? Finding that alignment. And that has been really powerful for me. So I think those two things are for me what has, let's say, led me on this path, where not only am I absolutely convinced that this is a huge societal issue that we need to tackle, but also that, I have a great opportunity as I lead this organization to be part of supporting this change. So, if your viewers or not viewers, but your listeners think I sound passionate about it, is because I am. And, I do think, or I hope at least, that we are at the start of something that can really transform lives. Like it will take a long time. It will take a lot of people. It will take much more than just me and you talking on this podcast. But I really do think maybe that why I feel that way is anchored in those two moments.
And your final thought to our listeners here on the podcast, if there's one action that you would encourage our listeners to, what would that be?
Well, it always depends on what they're doing, right? Because if you're a sporting goods company, I want you to come and talk to me and come and join the movement. If you're institutional sport, I want you to pivot your mindset around what it means to be a sports federation or a club, and to think, it's so easy. It's not so easy. That's not fair. It's the norm to think about, okay, player pathways. How do we get players up to, county level or national level or whatever? But the future of sport is rooted in making sure that we get these people who are inactive to come in and embrace sport and physical activity. And honestly, to do that, you have to be sport agnostic, right? It's not about do they play tennis? It's not about do they play badminton? It's about do they move and do they feel good while they're moving? And if we're able, or sport is able to somehow grow that base of the pyramid, take away competitive elements. It's not tennis v badminton or tennis v hockey. It's just getting kids to move and enjoy moving. The pie will be bigger for all of us, and we'll have solved one of society's biggest challenges going forward. So that's my ask. Let's use a different lens.
Emma, thank you very much, very, very much for being with us. And
thanks to me too.
That's a wrap on today's episode of The Power of Play. If you liked this discussion, then please follow us, like us, comment on our content, and remember, the game does not end when the whistle blows. The real impact happens beyond the pitch. So keep playing, keep pushing, and see you next time on the next episode of The Power of Play.